Let's have a closer look at JSX. Now, I mentioned before, earlier in this module, you can open up your developer tools, and there you'll find the JavaScript code which is responsible for what you're seeing on the page. And in there, you will also find all your component functions, like this app function here. Now, it will look totally different in the end, because there you have no JSX code, because JSX code isn't supported by the browser. This in the end is just syntactic sugar, which works here thanks to the behind-the-scenes transformations. Now we can see that the code to which it is transformed in the end looks like this here, right? This here is the code to which it is transformed. Now, this is code which still is fairly cryptic, because this actually is the final step of the transformation. We could also write code instead of this JSX code, which is a bit more readable to us humans than this, but not as readable as the JSX code. I still want to show it to you because this shows you what this JSX code actually represents behind the scenes. So here we go. Maybe you already wondered about one other thing. In package.json, we got a bunch of dependencies, and most of them are just dealing with the behind-the-scenes transformations. But we got two dependencies which are related to React. React and React DOM. Now, we are using React DOM in the index.js file, but we are never using React anywhere. We're never importing React anywhere. And this actually just works in this kind of project setup and in all modern React project setups which are created by Create React App. In a lot of other React projects which you'll find out there in the wild, you will actually see React imports, even though we don't have them here. Because in the past, in older React projects, you actually needed to import React from React in all your React component files. To be precise, in all files where you used JSX. You needed to always import React from React in the past. And you'll still see a lot of React projects out there which have these imports therefore. Now that we can omit this import now is really just some magic being done by modern React project setups. We needed this import in the past because this JSX code, as I mentioned, is just syntactic sugar. And under the hood, it is actually transformed to methods called on this React object, which is why we needed to import React in the past. Now let me show you what this code would look like if we wouldn't use this JSX syntax. And therefore I'll comment this out and return this alternative. Because on this imported React object, there is a create element method which we can call. And when you use JSX, it's in the end this method which is called. Create element takes 3 arguments. The first argument is the element which should be created. For example, a div. And if it's a built-in HTML element, you just pass in a string with the name of that element, like div. The second argument is an object that configures this element, specifically an object which sets all the attributes of this element. This div has no attributes, so here we can pass in an empty object. The third argument now is the content between the opening and closing div tags. And actually, it's not just a third argument. You can now have an infinitely long list of arguments, which are the different content pieces between the opening and closing tags. So here we have 2 elements, so we would have 2 extra arguments. The third argument would be our h2 element, so the first child in that div. And therefore here, again, we would call React create element and create a h2 element here. And that h2 element again has no attributes, so the second argument of this second create element call would be an empty object. And the third argument of this create element call would be the content in this h2 tag, so this string in this case. So we would pass this string here and escape this single quote. And if we now format it, it would look like this. Now, next to this second create element call, we could have a third create element call, which is the neighbor element to this h2 element, so this expenses component. Again, we create an element here, but now we're working with a custom component instead of a built-in one. In such cases, you don't use a string here, but you just point at your imported function, which it in the end is, because your components are just functions, right? So here we set expenses. We point at expensive as an element here. The second argument is an object of properties that should be set, of attributes that should be set. And here we have the items prop, the items attribute. So we would add an items key here. Keep in mind, this is just a JavaScript object. So we have the property name and then a colon and then the value, which here would be expenses. And then as a third argument, we have the content between the opening and closing tags. And in this case, there is no such content, so we omit it. And this here would be the alternative to this JSX code using this React object. And therefore, if I save that, and we go back to the screen, we see exactly the same as before. Now, you could write your entire React app like this. It just turns out that this is a bit harder to read and a bit more cumbersome than using this JSX code. But that's why you needed to import React from React in all your component files in the past, because this is the under-the-hood code which kind of gets created automatically when you use JSX. Now, in more modern project setups, you can omit this React import because the project setup is able to make that transformation without the import being added. But if you see component functions where this import is there, it is there because in the past you always did need to add it. And therefore, because of that reason, I will now also import it and add it to all components where I use some JSX code. Like here, index.js, expenses.js, expense item.js, expense date.js, and card.js. Again, you technically don't need to do that, but I'm doing it to really emphasize that React is still being used under the hood here when you use JSX code, because that code under the hood is transformed to something like this before it's then transformed even more to what we saw in the browser earlier. That's important. And if you have a look at this code, it should also be clear why you need some wrapping element as a root JSX element, why you can't have just these two side-by-side elements being returned. Because how would you write this in the React create element world? You, in the end, would be trying to return this, and that doesn't work. You can't return more than one thing. You could return an array, sure, but this is not an array of elements. This is two separate elements side by side. That's why you always need such a wrapper, because in the create element world, you always create one element, which then may have more child elements. So that's why we have this one wrapper root JSX element, which we always need. This is why we need that. That's the under the hood, behind the scenes stuff that is going on. Now I will comment this out and go back to the JSX solution, because of course we're going to write JSX code in the course. After all, this is way more convenient. But it is important to understand what is happening under the hood and how React works.